Imagine for a moment that you are the most powerful person alive. You command armies. You own castles. Entire kingdoms bow at your feet. People write poems about your greatness. Bards sing songs of your glory. And yet, every single morning, without fail, you wake up, you sit on a cold stone seat, and you wait. You wait for someone to hand you a towel. You wait for someone to dress you. You wait for someone to approve what you are going to eat. You wait for a priest to finish praying over your breakfast. And then, if you are very lucky, maybe, just maybe, something mildly interesting happens before sunset. Welcome, dear listener, to the surprisingly boring daily schedule of a medieval king. Now, before you drift off, and drifting off, truly, is perfectly welcome here. I want you to stay with me just a little while longer, because what you are about to hear is not the story of battles and dragon slaying and heroic charges across muddy fields. No, what you are about to hear is the real story, the quiet story, the slow, thick, wonderfully dull story of what it actually felt like to be a king on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in the year 1100 and something. And I promise you, by the end of this journey, you will feel so deeply, so beautifully relaxed, that sleep will find you the way fog finds a valley in the early morning, quietly, gently, and completely. So settle in. Pull your blanket just a little tighter. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. And let us begin, together, at the very beginning of a medieval king's day, which started not with trumpets, not with drama, but with something far more human than either of those things. It started with a king who really did not want to get out of bed. The bed itself, if we are being honest, was one of the few genuinely pleasant things about being a medieval king. By the standards of the 11th, 12th, or 13th century, a royal bed was a construction of almost absurd luxury. It was not simply a mattress on a frame. It was an entire architectural statement. The frame was carved from the finest oak or walnut, sometimes imported from forests so far away that the wood alone cost more than most peasants would earn in a lifetime. The mattress, and this is where it gets particularly interesting, was not one mattress but several, layered one on top of another like the pages of a very comfortable book. At the very bottom sat a thick straw pallet, rough and sturdy, which served as the foundation. On top of that came a mattress stuffed with wool, which added softness and warmth. And on top of that, in the grandest royal households, came a feather mattress, stuffed with the down of geese and swans, so soft that sinking into it must have felt something like falling slowly through a cloud. And then the linens. Oh, the linens were extraordinary. They were washed, which was actually more than could be said of many things in the medieval world. And they were scented, sometimes with dried lavender or rosemary tucked between the folds, so that the whole bed carried a faint herbal perfume that drifted through the royal chamber like a memory of summer. The pillows were plump and numerous, propped against a heavy wooden headboard, and the whole magnificent construction was surrounded on 3 or sometimes 4 sides by heavy curtains that could be drawn closed at night. These bed curtains were not decorative in the way we might think of decorative today. They were deeply practical. Stone castles, no matter how grand, were cold. Drafts crept under doors and through the gaps in window shutters, and along the floor, and up through the cracks in the masonry. And a curtain bed was essentially a small warm room within a room, trapping the heat of the body and holding it close through the long, dark medieval night. So when the king woke in the morning, he woke inside this curtained cocoon, this warm and faintly lavender-scented pocket of comfort, and the world outside those curtains was cold and gray and full of obligations. And it is honestly not difficult to imagine that even the most powerful man in the kingdom lay there for a moment or two, or perhaps several minutes, simply not moving, blinking slowly at the inside of the bed curtain, thinking about absolutely nothing at all. But the world would not wait indefinitely for a king to finish not thinking, because within the royal chamber, there were already people. This is one of the stranger facts about medieval royal life that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. The king was almost never alone. Not at breakfast, not at dinner, not in his gardens, not in his council chambers, and disturbingly, not in his bedchamber either. The men who served the king in his most private morning moments were called the grooms of the chamber, and in the grandest courts, the most senior among them held the almost incomprehensibly prestigious title of groom of the stool, a title that was prestigious precisely because it involved doing something that sounds deeply unprestigious, which was attending to the king during his use of the royal clothes stool, which was the medieval equivalent of the toilet. Now the clothes stool itself deserves a moment of description, because it was not, as one might assume, simply a hole in the floor or a bucket in the corner. In a grand royal household, the clothes stool was a padded wooden box with a hole in the top, beneath which sat a removable chamber pot, and the whole thing was sometimes upholstered in velvet or fine cloth, and the groom of the stool was responsible for providing the necessary water and linen for the king's hygiene, and for disposing of everything afterward with discretion and efficiency. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that tells you everything you need to know about the strange logic of medieval court hierarchy, is that this position was genuinely coveted. Lords competed for it. Noble families considered it an honor, because to attend the king in his most private moments was to have his ear in a way that no public courtier ever could. The conversation that happened in that small, quiet, early morning space, before the day had properly started, and before the court had gathered, and before everyone had their masks properly on, was considered some of the most valuable in the kingdom. Advice given, there was advice given directly, without intermediary, without audience, without the layers of protocol that surrounded every other moment of the royal day. So the groom of the stool, despite the nature of his duties, was often one of the most genuinely influential men in the entire court. Which is a reminder, if one were needed, that power in the medieval world, as in most worlds, operated in wonderfully strange and indirect ways. Once the king had completed his morning ablutions, and ablutions is exactly the right word here, rich and old and slow-sounding, the business of dressing began. And dressing a medieval king was not a quick affair. It was, in its own way, a ceremony, a ritual, something that had its own order, its own logic, its own set of people responsible for each specific part. There was someone whose job it was to hand the king his shirt. There was someone else whose job it was to hand him his hose, which were the tight-fitting leg coverings that medieval men wore, more like stockings than trousers, made of fine wool or occasionally silk in the royal household. There was someone to help with the tunic, someone for the belt, someone for the shoes. And the shoes themselves were a small production, because royal footwear in the medieval period went through extraordinary fashions. There were periods when the toes of shoes were so long and so pointed that they had to be attached by a small chain to the knee to keep them from flopping on the ground as the wearer walked. And there were other periods where shoes were broader and more practical. And then there were the elaborate embroidered slippers worn for indoor audiences, and the heavy leather boots worn for outdoor activities, and knowing which shoes were appropriate for which occasion on which day was itself a kind of specialized knowledge. The king's outer robe, the garment that the rest of the court would see, that would be read as a signal of mood and occasion and royal intention, was chosen with care. The colors mattered. Deep reds and purples conveyed authority and wealth, because the dyes required to produce those colors were expensive beyond the imagining of ordinary people, coming from beetles and mollusks and exotic plants traded across vast distances. Blues conveyed a kind of serene dignity. Greens and golds conveyed youth and celebration. And the fabric, velvet, brocade, heavy silk damask, fine wool from the English Cotswolds or the Flemish towns, each told a story that the assembled court could read at a glance without a word being spoken. So the choice of robe was not vanity. Or not only vanity, it was communication. It was political messaging delivered in thread and color before a single syllable had been uttered. And while all of this was happening, While the king was being dressed and brushed and adjusted and polished like a very important object being prepared for display, the royal chamber was already filling with sound and activity. Servants moved quietly through the space, relighting the fire if it had gone low in the night, carrying fresh water, removing the evidence of the night. The smell of the chamber in the morning was, let's be honest about this, not entirely pleasant. Stone rooms with limited ventilation accumulated the smoke of the fire, the smell of the rushes on the floor, rushes which were strewn across stone floors as a kind of rough carpet, mixed with dried herbs and flowers in royal households, but which nonetheless accumulated the detritus of daily life, the smell of bodies and tallow candles and last night's food and the general clothes, lived in quality of a room that has been occupied and sealed against the cold all night. The scented herbs helped. Beeswax candles were better than tallow ones. But the morning air of a medieval castle bedchamber was, by our standards, thick and layered and very, very old-smelling. And it is one of those details that reminds you how utterly different the sensory experience of the medieval world was from anything we know today. Now fully dressed, at least in his underclothes and basic robes, there would be more adjustments later, more layers added or removed depending on the day's requirements. The king moved toward his first formal obligation of the morning, which was prayer. Medieval kings were Christian kings, and their Christianity was not a private, personal matter that they could set aside when it became inconvenient. It was public, performed, witnessed, and mandatory. The king was expected to attend Mass every single day, without exception, because the king's relationship with God was understood as being deeply connected to the well-being of the kingdom. A pious king, people believed, would be protected by God. A sinful or neglectful king would bring divine punishment down not just on himself, but on everyone under his rule. The harvests, the weather, the outcomes of battles, the health of the royal children, all of these were understood to be, at least partially, a reflection of the king's spiritual state. So attending Mass was not optional any more than breathing was optional. It was simply part of what a king was. The royal chapel in a great medieval castle or palace was usually a beautifully appointed space, even by the standards of a generally beautiful building. The windows, if the castle was grand enough, were glazed, real glass, colored and leaded, casting jewels of red and blue and gold light across the stone floor when the morning sun hit them. The altar was adorned with fine cloth and silverwork and candles, and the priest who said the royal mass was often a learned and senior churchman, not some village curate but a royal confessor, a man of education and connections and spiritual authority who had his own access to the king's ear and his own position in the complex web of court relationships. The Mass itself, in the medieval period, was said in Latin, not spoken aloud to the congregation but murmured by the priest, often with his back to the king, facing the altar, so that what the king heard was a stream of soft Latin syllables rising and falling in the familiar pattern of the liturgy, washing over him like water, and what he was expected to do was kneel, and bow his head, and think pious thoughts. And if the king was tired, and if the Latin was very familiar and very soft and very rhythmic, and if the chapel was warm from its candles and its small congregation of bodies, then it is perfectly possible, perhaps even likely, that more than one medieval king spent at least a portion of his morning Mass in a state that was not entirely unlike sleep. Not that anyone would have admitted it. Not that anyone would have dared to say so. But the human need for sleep is a force that respects no hierarchy, and the sound of Latin murmured by a priest in a warm chapel is, objectively, one of the most soporific sounds that has ever existed in the history of sound. So let us not judge the medieval king too harshly for the occasional drowsy moment in the royal pew. Let us, instead, understand him completely. After Mass came breakfast. And here again, the word breakfast requires some adjustment, because the medieval royal breakfast was not the elaborate multi-course affair you might imagine if you were thinking of Tudor feasts or Hollywood banquets. The morning meal in the medieval period was generally modest by comparison with the main meal of the day, which came in the early afternoon. Breakfast, called the jantaculum in the Latin of the period, a word so obscure and so quietly pleasant to say that it deserves a moment of appreciation, was often simply bread and ale, or bread and wine for those of higher status, sometimes accompanied by cold meat left from the previous day's feast, or a soft cheese, or perhaps some dried fruit. The bread itself was worth thinking about, because bread in a royal household was white, made from finely sifted wheat flour from which most of the bran had been removed, which was a mark of enormous privilege, because the sifting process was labor-intensive and the resulting loaf was softer and more delicate than the dark, heavy bread that most people ate. The ale was not, it should be said, the strong hoppy beer of later centuries. Early medieval ale was lighter, slightly sour, not particularly alcoholic by modern standards, and it was drunk by everyone including children because water in many places was genuinely not safe to drink, and the slight fermentation of ale made it safer and more nutritious than the alternatives. The king ate breakfast in his chamber, or in a small private dining space attached to his chamber, and he ate it with his close attendants around him, not yet with the full court, not yet in the great hall with its noise and its formality, but in this smaller, more intimate space where the day had not yet fully assembled itself into something requiring royal attention. And the ale was poured, and the bread was cut, and the fire crackled softly in the grate. And outside the thick stone walls of the castle, the morning world was going about its business. The stable hands feeding the horses, the kitchen servants already deep in the preparations for the midday meal, the sentries on the walls walking their slow circuits in the gray morning air, and inside, in the king's chamber, the day was still soft at its edges, still half-formed, still carrying something of the quality of early morning, of that liminal space between sleep and the full demands of waking. This was, by most historical accounts we have, actually one of the pleasanter times of a medieval king's day. The obligations had not yet fully arrived. The petitioners had not yet gathered. The counselors had not yet begun their competing urgencies. There was just breakfast, just bread and ale, just the fire, just the slow beginning of another day that would, in all likelihood, unfold in much the same way as the day before it, and the day before that, and the 100 days before that. Now some historians and some readers, when they encounter this picture of the medieval king's morning, feel a certain disappointment. Where, they want to know, are the battles? Where is the drama? Where is the moment when the king strides into the great hall and makes some tremendous declaration that changes the course of history? And the answer, which is a true and honest answer, is that those moments did happen. They happened sometimes, occasionally, in the long life of a reign, but they were separated by vast stretches of exactly this. Bread and ale, and a warm fire, and a priest saying mass, and a servant handing over a shoe and a thick feather mattress that nobody wanted to leave in the morning. The extraordinary was the exception. The ordinary was the rule. And the ordinary, when you look at it closely, when you really settle into it and let it expand to its full size, is actually more interesting than the extraordinary in some ways. Because it is more human. Because it is more true. Because it is, in the end, more like the life most of us actually live. After breakfast, the king's day began to acquire its more formal shape. This was the time for what we might loosely call administrative business, though the word administrative is perhaps too modern, too clinical for what it actually involved. In practice, it meant that the king sat, usually in a specially designated chamber, the audience chamber or the presence chamber, a room that was grander than the private chamber, but not yet as grand as the great hall, and people came to him. People with problems, people with requests, people with complaints that had worked their way up through the lower levels of royal administration and had failed to be resolved there and had finally arrived, like a stone rolling slowly downhill, at the king himself. And the king listened, or he appeared to listen, which was not always the same thing, but was close enough to get through the morning. A lord from the north wanted confirmation of a land grant that his grandfather had received 3 generations ago, and which had recently been disputed by a neighboring lord who also claimed the land on the basis of a different document of equal antiquity. The details of this dispute involved not just the land itself, but 2 rivers, a mill, the fishing rights in a particular pond, and the question of which of the 2 lords was responsible for maintaining a section of road that passed through the disputed territory. The king heard this case, or his appointed justiciars heard it with the king nominally presiding, and a judgment was made, or deferred, or referred to a specialized court, and then the next case came forward, and it was a dispute about a church living in a small village where 2 priests both claimed the right of appointment, and neither would yield. And then there was a matter concerning a merchant who said his ship had been improperly seized by a local lord who claimed the ship had been carrying contraband, and the merchant claimed it had been carrying nothing but wool, and the local lord claimed the wool itself was contraband because it had not been properly taxed, and the merchant said that the tax had been paid but the receipt had been lost in a fire, and the local lord said that was a very convenient fire, and on, and on, and on, through the morning, case by case, petition by petition, the ordinary, grinding, ceaseless business of governance, which is the business of resolving disputes about land and money and rights and precedent, most of which disputes were, when examined closely, genuinely boring. Not without importance, not without consequence, but boring, stubbornly, reliably, predictably boring. The king's role in all of this was not, in most medieval kingdoms, to personally solve every problem. Medieval governance was not that centralized, and no one person could possibly have processed the volume of business that a medieval kingdom generated. The king had advisors, many of them. He had a chancellor, who was essentially his chief administrator, responsible for the production of royal documents and the management of the royal seal, without which no document was official. He had a treasurer, responsible for royal finances. He had a constable and a marshal, responsible for military matters. He had a justiciar, in the English system, at least, responsible for the administration of justice in the king's absence or when the king chose to delegate. He had a council of great lords, the magnates of the kingdom, who expected to be consulted on matters of significant policy and who could cause considerable difficulty if they felt they were being ignored. He had bishops and archbishops, who were simultaneously men of the church and men of the state in ways that created perpetual entanglement and perpetual negotiation. And around all of these major figures orbited a whole solar system of lesser officials, clerks, messengers, household servants, and attendants, each with their own roles and their own expectations and their own very clear sense of where they ranked relative to everyone else around them. Navigating this world, keeping all of these people reasonably satisfied, managing the competing claims of church and nobility and law and tradition, was the actual daily work of medieval kingship. Not fighting, not ruling by decree, navigating, listening, waiting, deciding small things carefully and large things even more carefully, always aware that the great lords of the kingdom had swords and armies of their own, and that a king who made too many enemies among the people who were supposed to support him was a king whose reign might end very suddenly and very badly indeed. The morning of administration drifted, like all mornings do, toward noon. And noon was the signal for the midday meal, which in the medieval schedule was the main meal of the day, the centerpiece around which the rest of the day's eating orbited. In a royal household, the midday meal was taken in the Great Hall, and the Great Hall was one of the defining spaces of medieval architecture. A large, high-ceilinged room, its roof supported by great timber beams or stone arches, its walls hung with tapestries that served the double purpose of decoration and insulation, keeping the cold of the stone walls from seeping into the room and making it just slightly more bearable in winter. The floor of the Great Hall was covered with fresh rushes, changed more regularly in royal households than in lesser ones, and the high table at the far end of the hall was set on a raised platform called the dais, so that the king and his most senior guests sat visibly above everyone else in the room, a physical representation of hierarchy that left no one in any doubt about where they stood, literally and figuratively. The meal began with ceremony. Hands were washed. There were servants whose specific job it was to carry ewers of water and linen towels to each person at the high table before eating began, pouring the water over hands held above a bowl, wiping them dry, moving on. This hand-washing was not merely hygienic, though it served that purpose as well. It was ritual. It marked the beginning of the meal as a formal occasion, and in a world where the boundary between the sacred and the secular was much more porous than it is today, a formal meal in a royal hall carried something of the quality of a ceremony, an event with its own order and meaning beyond the simple consumption of food. The food itself, and here we arrive at something that is genuinely impressive, that rises above the general background hum of boring competence that characterized most of medieval royal life, was extraordinary by any standard. Not always beautiful, not always delicate, but extraordinary in its abundance, its variety, its ambition, and the sheer organizational complexity of producing it. A royal feast, even a regular midday meal in a well-appointed royal household, might include 10, 15, 20 separate dishes, served in a sequence of courses that were called removes, each remove bringing a new collection of dishes to the table. There was roasted meat, great joints of beef, whole pigs, haunches of venison from the royal forests, where hunting was a royal privilege and poaching was punishable by severe penalties. There were birds, pheasants, swans, peacocks, herons, larks, chickens, geese, all varieties of fowl that could be caught or raised or received as gifts from those who wished to demonstrate their loyalty through the medium of poultry. The more exotic the bird, the greater the prestige of serving it, and peacock in particular was considered almost ostentatiously royal, sometimes served with its feathers reattached after roasting, its great tail spread like a fan, making the bird look almost alive again if you didn't think about it too carefully. There were fish dishes, because the Christian calendar demanded days of abstinence from meat, Fridays, and the whole season of Lent, and various saints' days scattered through the year, and so the royal kitchen maintained an enormous repertoire of fish preparations. Fresh river fish were available where rivers ran nearby. Salted cod and herrings came from the coast. Eels were a particular medieval delicacy, prepared in dozens of ways. Oysters were common and relatively cheap, which seems astonishing from a modern perspective, where oysters carry a particular aura of luxury. Porpoise and whale were considered fish for the purposes of fasting regulations, and their appearance at royal tables was not unheard of, though the logistics of acquiring and preparing them suggest that someone in the royal kitchen earned their salary several times over every time they appeared. There were pottages, thick, slow-cooked soups or stews, rich with vegetables and herbs, and sometimes meat, the medieval equivalent of the slow-cooked dish that sits on the back of the stove for hours and fills the whole house with its smell. There were pastries and pies, because medieval cooks were masters of the pie in ways that are genuinely impressive, creating enormous pastry shells called coffins which served as edible containers for all manner of fillings. The pastry in many cases was not meant to be eaten. It was thick and hard, and served more as a cooking vessel and a carrying case than as a pleasure in itself. But the fillings inside were sometimes extraordinary, intricate combinations of meat and spice and dried fruit that reflected the medieval love of mixing sweet and savory flavors in ways that feel unfamiliar to modern palates, but are actually, when you try them, startlingly good. And the spices. The spices deserve their own paragraph, because in the medieval world, spices were the medieval equivalent of jewelry. They were expensive, wildly so. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cardamom, saffron. and they came from impossibly far away, from India and the Spice Islands and the markets of Venice and Alexandria, traveling by ship and caravan across half the world to end up in the kitchen of a European king, where a cook shook them lavishly over roasted meat, or stirred them into wine, or folded them into pastry cream as a demonstration of royal wealth that everyone at the table could taste. Using spices extravagantly was a statement. It said, "We can afford this. We can afford to make your food taste of the East, of distance, of the unimaginable journeys these small dried seeds and bark shavings have made to reach your plate. Eat, and understand that you are eating wealth itself." The wine flowed throughout the meal, poured by servants who were responsible for the buttery, the store of wine and ale, and who maintained a careful accounting of what was consumed, because even in royal households, the management of resources was a constant and serious concern. Medieval wine was different from modern wine in ways that are worth noting. It traveled badly, without the benefit of temperature control or proper bottling, and wine that had come a long way was often on the edge of turning, which is why medieval drinkers frequently added honey, spices, or other flavorings to their wine, partly because they liked the taste, but also partly because these additions could make a wine that was beginning to sour into something more palatable. Hippocras, a spiced wine sweetened with honey, was a popular drink at royal tables, warming and aromatic and carrying that spiced sweetness that the medieval palate craved. And there was ale, still, always, for those who preferred it or who ranked below the level where wine was automatically provided. In a great medieval household, the amount of ale consumed was genuinely staggering by modern standards. Accounts from English royal households in the medieval period suggest daily consumption of ale that runs into hundreds of gallons for a full household, because everyone drank it with every meal, because it was considered nutritious and filling, and because the alternatives were, again, limited. The meal in the Great Hall was not just eating. It was theater. It was the king on display, dining in public, surrounded by his court, visible and accessible in a way that was politically important. Great lords needed to see their king regularly, needed to witness his health and his mood and his authority in person, because a king who withdrew from public view was a king who invited rumor and speculation and the kind of anxiety that bred unrest. So the meal in the Great Hall was also the moment when the court assembled, when people who needed to catch the king's attention tried to position themselves where he might notice them, when gifts were sometimes presented, when news from other courts or other parts of the kingdom might be announced, when entertainment was provided. Music was played throughout the meal, a small ensemble of musicians in the gallery above the Great Hall, playing quiet background music that filled the space without demanding attention, the medieval equivalent of a restaurant soundtrack. Sometimes there were more elaborate entertainments. A jongleur, a performer who combined juggling and acrobatics and storytelling, might be engaged to perform between courses, moving through the hall with the kind of energetic, crowd-pleasing skill that had been honed over a lifetime of performing for difficult audiences in drafty halls. A harper might play a longer piece, a narrative song about heroes and battles, the kind of story that everyone in the hall knew well enough to follow, but that was always worth hearing again in a skilled telling. And occasionally, for great feasts on important occasions, there were elaborate theatrical productions, pageants and disguisings, where performers in costumes represented allegorical figures, the virtues, the seasons, the ancient heroes, and acted out scenes that the court was expected to understand as commentary on current political events or compliments to the king's magnificence, delivered in the indirect and ornamental language of allegory, because that was safer and more elegant than saying things directly. But on an ordinary day, a regular Tuesday or Wednesday in the middle of a quiet year, the entertainment was modest, the meal was substantial but not extravagant, and the great hall gradually emptied as the meal drew to its close, the court dispersing back to their various tasks and conversations and private intrigues, and the servants clearing the trestle tables, literally lifting the long boards off their X-shaped supports and stacking them against the wall to clear the space. And the dogs, that had been lurking hopefully at the edges of the hall during the meal, now moved in to clean the rushes of anything edible that had been dropped, which was, in a hall full of people eating without the benefit of modern table manners, quite a lot. The dogs in a royal household were not stray animals. They were valued members of the household in their own way. The hunting dogs in particular, greyhounds and alants and various hounds bred for the chase, were expensive and carefully maintained animals whose bloodlines were tracked with as much care as the bloodlines of the horses or, in some cases, the nobles. They ate well, better than many people ate, and they lived long and apparently contented lives in the warm spaces of the royal hall. A king without dogs would have been an extremely unusual king. After the midday meal came the hour, or sometimes more than an hour. That was the closest thing the medieval king had to genuine, unstructured free time. This was the time for rest, the digestive pause in the middle of the day that the medieval schedule built in as a matter of course, because after a substantial meal, the body requires rest, and this was simply accepted as a fact of life rather than a sign of weakness. Some kings used this time to sleep. A genuine nap in the royal chamber, curtains drawn, the world held at bay for an hour while the digestive processes of the royal body did their slow and steady work. Others used it for conversation, the informal kind, with close companions and favorites, the kind of talk that didn't go anywhere in particular and didn't need to, that wandered from subject to subject without agenda. That was simply pleasant. Chess was a popular occupation at this time. Medieval chess was not quite modern chess. The pieces moved slightly differently. The queen was far less powerful. The game played at a slightly different pace, but it was recognizably the same game, and it was understood as a game for the educated and the noble, a game that demonstrated strategic thinking and patience and the ability to hold a complex picture in the mind. A king who played chess was understood to be a king who possessed the mental qualities required for governance. And kings who played badly or who lost their tempers when they lost at chess were noted and remembered and discussed by the court in exactly the way you would expect. Others filled this afternoon space with reading, or, in the earlier medieval period, having things read to them, because literacy among the laity, even among the nobility, was not universal in the early medieval centuries, though it improved significantly over time. The texts that were read or recited were often religious, saints' lives, devotional works, scripture, but they also included histories, which were deeply popular in the medieval royal court because history, in the medieval understanding, was not just a record of the past, but a treasury of examples, a collection of lessons about how to rule and how to live and how to fail. The great deeds of Alexander the Great, of Julius Caesar, of Charlemagne, of the heroes of ancient Troy, these were not ancient history in the sense of being distant and irrelevant. They were living examples, immediately applicable to the present, and a medieval king who modeled himself on the virtues of these great men was doing something active and intentional, not merely nostalgic. There were also romances, the long narrative poems and prose tales that we now call the Matter of Britain and the Matter of France and the Matter of Rome, stories of King Arthur and his knights, of Charlemagne's paladins, of the heroes of classical antiquity reimagined in medieval dress. These were the popular entertainment of the educated medieval world, the medieval equivalent of a compelling novel or a long television series, full of adventure and love and treachery and moral complexity, and they were wildly popular among kings and queens and nobles across Europe. The queen, if we have not yet mentioned her, existed alongside the king in this daily schedule in a way that was parallel but not identical. She had her own household, her own ladies-in-waiting, her own administrative responsibilities, her own time for prayer and for recreation, and depending on the specific queen and the specific king and the specific moment in their relationship, she might have significant political influence. shaping policy through quiet counsel, managing diplomatic relationships through correspondence, exercising authority over the territories that were part of her dower lands, raising the royal children in the careful and deliberate way that royal child-rearing required. Or she might be largely ornamental, present at feasts and ceremonies and important occasions, but otherwise living a somewhat separate life within the same walls. Medieval queenship was a complex and varied institution, and the queen's daily schedule deserves its own full telling, though today we are focused on the king. But she was there. She was always there, somewhere in the day's architecture, at mass in the morning, at the meal in the great hall, in the garden in the afternoon perhaps, walking slowly between the raised beds of herbs and flowers with her ladies, their voices low and their embroidery in their hands, a small island of feminine calm in the generally masculine noise of the castle. The garden was, for the queen especially, one of the genuine pleasures of the medieval royal day, a space that was beautiful, that smelled of growing things, that was enclosed enough to feel private and open enough to feel free. The royal garden in a well-appointed medieval castle was not a wild or naturalistic space. It was formal, ordered, controlled, exactly as you would expect from a culture that valued hierarchy and order in everything. There were raised beds of herbs, culinary herbs like thyme and rosemary and sage, medicinal herbs like feverfew and comfrey and valerian, fragrant herbs like lavender and sweetbriar that were grown partly for their scent. There were fruit trees, trained against south-facing walls to catch the maximum amount of pale northern sunlight, espaliered into flat, geometric shapes: apple, pear, plum, cherry. There might be a fountain or a small pool, because moving water was considered beautiful and its sound was understood to be both pleasant and beneficial to the constitution. There were grassy turf seats, not chairs, but raised sections of turf, sometimes enclosed by low hedges, covered in a thick, soft, lawn-like growth of chamomile or sweet herbs, where you could sit and feel the sun and smell the garden and let the afternoon move at its own pace. The garden wall enclosed all of this from the noise of the castle beyond, and inside that wall the world was green and scented and quiet, and the sound of the fountain was constant and unhurried. And if you sat there long enough with your embroidery or your chess or your quiet conversation, the afternoon could drift by without your quite noticing it going. By mid-afternoon, the king was back at work. There were letters to dictate. The king did not write his own letters in most cases, because letter writing was the province of the clerks, the educated men who served as the king's scribes and secretaries, writing in the careful and highly stylized Latin or vernacular prose of the period, in a hand that took years to develop, and that was itself a mark of education and skill. The king would indicate what he wanted to communicate to a great lord, to a bishop, to a foreign king, to a pope, and the clerk would compose the actual text, working within the elaborate conventions of medieval letter writing that specified how one addressed different ranks of correspondent, what formulas were used for opening and closing, what tone was appropriate for different kinds of message. The king might review the draft, might add a point or correct an emphasis, might sign the finished letter, or make his mark, or press his ring into the wax seal that authenticated the document. But the actual labor of writing was performed by someone else. This was not because kings were illiterate, though some were. It was because the medieval understanding of governance included a clear division of labor, and the labor of writing was understood as clerical work, the work of the clerks, derived from the same Latin root as the word clergy, because in the early medieval period the church had essentially monopolized literacy, and most of the men who could read and write were churchmen of one kind or another. The letters went out to all corners of the kingdom and beyond it, to sheriffs in distant counties, instructing them on the management of local affairs, to great lords, requesting or demanding or gently suggesting various courses of action, to abbeys and monasteries, which were both spiritual institutions and significant landowners and economic actors, requiring their own careful management. To the courts of neighboring kings, maintaining the delicate diplomatic relationships that kept the peace or prepared for the wars that occasionally disrupted it. To Rome, where the Pope sat at the center of an ecclesiastical network that touched every corner of Christian Europe and whose goodwill a king needed to maintain, even while navigating the perpetual friction between royal authority and papal authority over matters like the appointment of bishops and the jurisdiction of church courts. The diplomatic correspondence alone, the careful, formal, precisely worded letters between royal courts, represents an enormous proportion of what has survived from the medieval period, and reading through it, as historians do, is an experience that is simultaneously fascinating and deeply, profoundly tedious, because diplomatic correspondence is by its nature cautious and formulaic and slow, full of elaborate courtesies and indirect approaches and messages that could be read several ways, depending on the relationship and the moment, which is, of course, the point, but not always the most exciting reading. In between the letter writing, there were councils, formal meetings of the king with his senior advisors, convened to discuss matters of policy. The structure of these councils varied by kingdom and by era, but the general pattern was consistent. The king presided, the great officers of state, and the senior lords and senior churchmen spoke in order of rank. Arguments were made and countered, and eventually, through persuasion or through the king's own authority or sometimes through a kind of weary consensus that emerged when everyone had been talking for long enough, a decision was reached or deferred to a future meeting or sent for. More information before a decision could responsibly be made. Council meetings were the engine room of medieval governance, and like most engine rooms, they were not glamorous. They were long. They were repetitive. They involved the same people saying versions of the same things they had said at previous meetings, because the great underlying problems of medieval governance, the perennial tension between royal authority and aristocratic independence, between the crown's need for money and the magnates' resistance to taxation, between the claims of the church and the claims of the state, did not change from meeting to meeting. They were addressed, partially, imperfectly, temporarily, and then they came back in a slightly different form at the next meeting, and the meeting after that, and the meeting after that. There was also, in the quieter seasons when war was not being contemplated and harvests were not failing and no particular crisis was demanding immediate attention, the business of justice. Medieval kings were expected to be, personally and directly, the source of justice in their kingdoms. The phrase "the king's justice" was not metaphorical. It referred to actual legal processes that operated in the king's name and, at their highest levels, involved the king's direct participation. Itinerant justices traveled the kingdom on circuits, holding courts in each county in the king's name, hearing cases and applying the king's law. But some cases involving great lords, cases raising important questions of royal prerogative, cases that had failed to find resolution in lower courts, came to the king himself, or to his central courts, and required royal attention. And the king sat in judgment, heard the arguments, rendered the verdict, signed the writ, and moved on to the next matter. Justice in the medieval period was not quick. The procedures were elaborate and expensive and slow, full of procedural requirements and technicalities and delays that any modern lawyer would recognize as familiar, because the instinct to delay and complicate legal proceedings is apparently a constant across the centuries. But the king sat through it, or as much of it as required his direct attention, because the administration of justice was not something that could be delegated entirely. It was too central to the idea of what a king was. And thus the afternoon accumulated, hour by careful hour, and the light through the castle windows moved from the sharp brightness of midday through the softer, more golden light of late afternoon, and the fire in the hall was built up against the approaching chill of evening, and the great grinding administrative machine of a medieval kingdom completed another day's work, and the scribes rolled up their documents and sealed them with wax, and handed them to messengers who would carry them to Their destinations over roads that were sometimes good and often bad, and occasionally barely roads at all, and the council members gathered their thoughts and their opinions and carried them away to their private chambers where they would discuss everything again among themselves in smaller groups with less ceremony. And the king stood up from his chair at the council table and was escorted back toward his private chambers by his household, because the day was moving toward its next great ceremony, which was dinner. Dinner, in the medieval household, confusingly, often served as what we would now call supper in the early evening, was another communal meal, though sometimes smaller than the midday feast, depending on the day and the occasion. On feast days and important occasions, dinner in the evening could actually be the larger and more elaborate meal, with more entertainment, more ceremony, more wine, more elaborate dishes. But on ordinary evenings, it was often a somewhat reduced version of the midday meal, still formal, still served in the great hall, still with the full panoply of servants and the high table and the hierarchy of seating, but perhaps with fewer removes, perhaps with entertainment that was quieter and more musical and less theatrical. After the energy expenditure of the long working day, the court gathered again in the great hall, not so much to impress as to unwind, to eat and drink in company, to let the long formal structure of the day loosen just slightly at the edges. The evening meal was when the entertainers really came into their own, the minstrels and the harpers, the storytellers and the jesters. The jester, or the court fool, was a more complex figure than the simple clown of later popular imagination. The royal fool occupied a very specific and very unusual position in the court hierarchy. He was outside it, or above it, or beneath it, or some combination of all three, in a way that gave him a freedom to say things that no one else in the court could say with safety. A fool could mock the king, could point out his contradictions, could name the things that everyone was thinking, but that protocol forbade anyone else from mentioning. And the king could laugh and take the mockery in good part, because the fool's license was understood, because the performance was theatrical and distanced, because it allowed a pressure valve for the tensions that built up in any enclosed, hierarchical community. The best fools were not merely funny. They were perceptive. They noticed things. They understood the dynamics of the court in the way that a person who exists slightly outside the normal rules of any system always understands it more clearly than those who are fully inside it. And the king who listened to his fool, who let himself be mocked and laughed, and heard the uncomfortable thing wrapped in the joke, was probably, in the long run, a better king for it, though no one would have put it that way at the time. After dinner, the evening began to wind down. The court lingered. There was music and conversation, and perhaps some gaming, dice or cards in the later medieval period, chess and tables, and other board games, gambling with small stakes. And then gradually people withdrew to their chambers, the junior members of the household first, then the senior, and finally the king himself, escorted back through the stone corridors by his household officers with their torches and their candles, the flickering light making the shadows jump on the tapestried walls, and back into the royal chamber where the fire had been built up and the bed curtains drawn and the sheets turned down and everything prepared for the night. And the groom of the chamber was there, and the groom of the stool, and all the small nighttime rituals were performed in reverse, the shoes removed, the outer robes taken off, the inner garments arranged for the night, perhaps a final cup of warm spiced wine taken beside the fire, and the king climbed into his magnificent layered bed, and the bed curtains were drawn closed around him, and the candles in the chamber were extinguished one by one, and the fire settled into its low nighttime burn, and the stone castle was quiet around its sleeping king, the sentries on the walls still walking their slow circuits in the dark, the kitchen fires banked for the night, the horses still in the stables, the dogs curled in the warm corners of the great hall. And the king lay in his curtained bed in the dark, and if he was the kind of king who worried, and most kings, if they were honest about it, were precisely the kind of king who worried, Then perhaps his mind moved through the things he had not yet resolved, the petition he had not yet answered, the letter from the French king that required a careful response, the question of the disputed land in the north that would probably require someone to ride there and look at the actual documents. Or perhaps he had learned, as people who have very demanding days tend to learn, to set these things aside when the day was over, to allow the night to be the night and the day to be the day, to let the accumulated weight of governance drop from his shoulders when the curtains closed and the world became small and warm and dark. Perhaps he thought of nothing in particular, just the faint sound of the fire, just the weight of the blankets, just the pillow beneath his head that smelled faintly of lavender and clean linen. Perhaps he thought about the hunting tomorrow, if the weather held, the pleasure of riding out through the forest with the hounds and the hawkers and the small army of hunting attendants, the one time in the royal day when something genuinely fast and exciting and uncertain might happen. Perhaps he thought about the queen. Perhaps he thought about his children, the princes and princesses who were in their own chambers with their own nurses and their own small domestic worlds, being raised for their own complicated futures. Perhaps he thought about his father, about the kingdom that had been handed to him and the weight of that handover, the sense of continuity and responsibility, and the slight vertigo that comes from being the latest in a long line of people who have sat in this same position and made these same decisions and lain in versions of this same bed, watching the last of the firelight flicker on the stone ceiling above. And then, at some point, without announcement or drama, the king slept. Because sleep is not respectful of crowns. Sleep comes for everyone in the end. The most powerful man in the kingdom and the humblest peasant in the most distant field both close their eyes in the dark, both breathe slowly, both let go of the day and fall into the deep, formless, democratic country of sleep where there are no kings and no peasants, no councils and no councils, no decisions to make and no lands to dispute, only the long, slow, restoring dark. And tomorrow, the bell would ring. The curtains would open. The groom of the chamber would be there with his towel. And it would all begin again, exactly as it had begun today, and the day before, and the day before that, in the great slow rhythm of the medieval royal year, turning like a wheel through its seasons of feast and fast, of hunting and harvest, of long summer days and long winter nights, each day much like the one before it, each day complete in itself, each day another ordinary day in the surprisingly, comfortingly, deeply boring life of a medieval king. The seasons, of course, shape the daily schedule in ways both large and small, and since we have followed the king through a single day, it is worth following him a little further through the year, because the year was the true unit of medieval time, the great cycle by which all things were measured and organized. The medieval year was not the secular, administrative year of our own time, running from January 1st to December 31st with its tax returns and fiscal quarters. It was a liturgical year, a year structured by the church calendar, full of feasts and fasts and saints' days and seasons of particular religious significance, and these religious rhythms were as natural and as unconscious to a medieval person as the rhythm of the weeks is to us. You knew what time of year it was not by looking at a date on a screen, but by knowing what was happening in the church, what the priest was wearing, what was being sung in the Mass, what you were or were not allowed to eat. Advent came before Christmas, a season of preparation and relative restraint, not as severe as Lent, but carrying something of the same quiet inward quality, a drawing in before the great expansion of Christmas itself. Christmas in a royal court was an event of weeks, not days. The Christmas season ran from Christmas Day through Twelfth Night, 12 days of feasting and celebration and entertainment. And for a medieval king, this meant 12 days of the Great Hall at its most magnificent, of the largest feasts and the most elaborate entertainments and the most expensive gifts and the most splendid display of royal magnificence. The lords of the kingdom gathered at the royal court for Christmas, and the gathering of all that power and ambition and expensive clothing in one place was simultaneously politically necessary and socially exhausting, because the king was on display every moment, every meal a performance, every encounter a negotiation wrapped in courtesy and goodwill and enormous quantities of roasted meat and spiced wine. The gift-giving at Christmas was an elaborate and carefully calibrated ritual, because in the medieval court, gifts were not casual. They were political acts. What you gave, to whom, in what quantity, with what accompanying gesture. All of this communicated your attitude toward the recipient, your assessment of their status, your intentions toward them, in ways that everyone in the court could read, and that would be discussed and analyzed for weeks afterward. The king gave gifts, and the king received gifts, and the careful management of this exchange required a kind of social intelligence that is genuinely impressive, that has nothing to do with the battlefield heroics that people usually associate with medieval power. Lent, by contrast, was the great quieting of the year. 6 weeks of fasting and prayer and reflection, during which the elaborate feasting and entertainment of the winter were replaced by a more austere and contemplative rhythm. No meat, or officially no meat, though the definition of meat was flexible in ways that required ongoing theological consultation, and the question of what exactly constituted a fish for fasting purposes generated a surprisingly large body of medieval argument. Less wine, more prayer, more time in the chapel, more time with devotional texts. The great hall was quieter, the feast smaller, the entertainment muted. There was something almost meditative about Lent in a royal court, a kind of enforced simplicity that must have come as a relief, in some ways, after the relentless social performance of Christmas. You couldn't feast elaborately because the fast forbade it. You couldn't host lavish entertainments because the season didn't permit them. You were, in a sense, off the hook for 6 weeks from some of the most demanding aspects of public kingship, and while the theological intention was penitence and spiritual renewal, the practical effect must sometimes have been something closer to rest. Easter broke the fast in a great explosion of celebration. The most theologically important feast of the Christian year, the resurrection at the center of the whole Christian story, and in a royal court it was celebrated with a return of all the feasting and ceremony that Lent had suspended, with an added quality of relief and joy that the long weeks of restraint gave to the breaking of the fast. The Easter lamb was real and abundant. The wine flowed freely. The music in the chapel was the full, elaborate polyphonic music of the great feasts, not the simple chanting of Lent. And the king rode in the Easter procession, and the court assembled in its finest clothes, and the year tilted toward spring. Summer brought its own gifts and obligations to the royal schedule. The longer days and better roads made travel possible in a way that the winter's mud and cold and short days did not, and medieval kings traveled constantly, partly out of necessity. Medieval governance depended on the physical presence of the king in different parts of the kingdom, because it was the only way to maintain direct control and direct communication, and partly because a large royal household eating everything in the vicinity of one castle and then moving on was an ancient and practical solution to the problem of supply. The royal household descended on a great lord's estate, like a very expensive and socially demanding guest, consuming the lord's food and wine and fodder for horses and fuel for fires. And in return the lord received the honor and the political advantage of having hosted the king, of having been seen in close proximity to royal power, of having had the opportunity to say things to the king directly that could not be said through letters or messengers. These royal progresses, as they were called, turned the summer into a slow journey through the kingdom, stopping at different castles and manor houses and abbeys and hunting lodges, each stay a few days or a few weeks. Each move a large and complicated logistical operation involving the transport of the royal household. The furniture, the clothes, the documents, the servants, the horses, the hunting dogs, the chapel equipment, the kitchen equipment, along roads that were, by any objective standard, absolutely appalling. Medieval roads were, in most of England and France and the rest of Northern Europe, not roads in the sense we would recognize. They were tracks, paths worn by ewes through fields and forests, widening where traffic was heavy and narrowing to almost nothing where it was light, muddy in wet weather and dusty in dry, full of ruts and holes and unmarked forks that required local knowledge to navigate correctly. Moving the royal household along these roads was a slow and laborious business, a great column of people and horses and wagons stretching back along the track, the king at the front riding his fine horse, the wagons creaking and lurching behind him, the servants on foot making the best time they could, the whole operation vulnerable to the endless English weather that could turn a tolerable road into a swamp in an afternoon. The king's own progress was faster, of course. He rode on horseback, not in a wagon, and a good horse on a passable track could cover 30 miles in a day without undue difficulty. But the household as a whole moved much more slowly, and there was always the problem of arrivals, of the king reaching the next destination and waiting for his household to arrive before the full apparatus of royal life could be set up and the round of daily obligations could resume. These intervals, waiting in a not-quite-ready castle while the wagons caught up and the servants unpacked and the cook found his way around an unfamiliar kitchen, were another kind of unscheduled time, another window in the rigid structure of the royal day through which simple, undemanding existence could sometimes be glimpsed. Hunting was the great outdoor occupation of the medieval king in summer and autumn, and it deserves more than a passing mention, because hunting in the medieval royal context was far more than a sport or a recreation. It was a formal and elaborate institution, governed by its own complex rules and rituals, supported by a substantial infrastructure of royal foresters and game wardens and kennels and mews for the hawks, consuming a significant portion of royal expenditure and attention, and valued by the king and his court for reasons that were practical, symbolic, and deeply pleasurable all at once. The royal forests were enormous reserves of land, not forest in the modern sense of dense woodland, but hunting grounds that included a mixture of woodland and open land and heath, all reserved for the king's exclusive use. Poaching in the royal forest was a serious crime, punishable in the earlier medieval period by blinding and castration, later somewhat reduced to imprisonment and fines, but always understood as an offense not just against property, but against royal authority itself, because the deer in the forest were the king's deer, and to take them was to take from the king. And the king's deer were protected with a ferocity that sometimes exceeded the protection offered to the king's human subjects. This severity has struck many historians and most modern readers as deeply unjust, and it was unjust, but it reflected the medieval understanding of the forest as a royal resource, a symbol of royal power made flesh and fur, the living wealth of the crown running wild in the king's land. The hunt itself, the formal royal hunt, with its full ceremonial, was another elaborate performance, as much a display of courtly skill and knowledge as a practical exercise in wildlife management. The terminology alone was a language within a language. Each species of game had its own specialized vocabulary for its behavior, its tracks, its droppings, its flight patterns. The proper way to handle a hawk was a body of knowledge that took years to acquire. The correct way to skin and butcher the deer after the kill, the process called the unmaking, followed a specific ritual sequence that demonstrated the hunter's knowledge and gave each participant in the hunt his or her proper share of the carcass according to rank. The dogs ran, the horns sounded, the hawks were launched into the cold autumn air, and the king rode hard across the landscape in a way that he almost never got to move through the rest of his daily life. Fast and physical and fully present in his body in a way that the sedentary obligations of governance simply did not allow. This was, for many medieval kings, the genuine pleasure of the day. Not the council meetings, not the petitions, not the letters, not the ceremonies. The hunt. The cold air, and the good horse, and the dogs ahead, and the quarry running, and for an hour or two, the simple animal joy of the chase. In these moments, the elaborate structure of medieval kingship fell away to its most basic form, which was a man riding hard across his land, alive and fast and free. But even the hunt had its protocols. Who rode beside the king? Who had the honor of the first strike? Who received which portion of the game? Nothing in the medieval court was without significance. Nothing was casual. Nothing was simply what it appeared to be. The hunt was pleasure, yes, but it was also politics, because everything was politics, because you were always watched, always assessed, always in a context that meant something beyond itself. The medieval king who forgot this, even for a moment, even in the middle of the chase, was a king who might find that he had inadvertently offended someone important by riding past them without acknowledgement, or given an honor to the wrong person, or failed to give an honor to someone who expected it. The court had a memory for slights that was extraordinarily long and detailed, and an offense committed in the hunting field could fester into genuine political difficulty if not carefully managed afterward. So even the pleasure had its weight, and even the freedom of the chase was bounded by the invisible fences of protocol. The autumn slid toward winter, and the days grew short, and the mud deepened, and the travel became harder, and the court settled into its winter quarters, usually the largest and most comfortable of the royal palaces, and the round of the year began again. Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, the long summer, the hunt, and always, the daily framework of prayer and meal and administration and counsel that gave the days their shape, that made one year very much like another, that created the remarkable continuity of medieval royal life in which the basic rhythm of the day changed very little from one decade to the next, from one century to the next, from one reign to the next. Kings came and kings went, and the succession was sometimes smooth and sometimes catastrophically not, and battles were fought and won and lost and fought again, and the great political crises that filled the history books erupted and were resolved or not resolved, and all of this happened against the background of this daily rhythm, this quiet, ordinary, endlessly repeated structure of getting up and praying and eating and governing and hunting and eating again and going to bed. The dramatic moments were the exceptions. The ordinary moments were the rule. And the ordinary moments, accumulated over days and months and years, were what a reign actually felt like from the inside. Not the battles, which lasted hours. Not the great political settlements, which required weeks of negotiation. But the days, the hundreds and thousands of ordinary days. The bread and ale in the morning, the mass in the chapel, the petition from the Lord about the disputed mill pond, the spiced wine at dinner, the fire in the bedchamber, the curtain drawn against the dark, the long, slow, surprising ordinariness of being the most powerful person in the world. And now, dear listener, if you have made it this far, if your breathing has slowed and your thoughts have softened, and the weight of the blanket above you has become something pleasant and real and grounding, then you have done exactly what this journey set out to accomplish. You have spent time in a world that is utterly foreign and utterly familiar at once, a world where the man at the top of the entire social order spent his days very much as we spend ours, moving through obligations and small pleasures and necessary repetitions and the occasional moment of genuine joy, surrounded by people whose opinions he had to manage and whose expectations he could not ignore, doing the work that his position required and finding, in the corners of that work, the small human things that made it bearable, the cup of spiced wine, the chess game in the afternoon, the horse's ears ahead of him in the early morning light before the hunt began, the smell of lavender in the pillow, the quiet, dark, curtained space at the end of the day where he was, finally, for a few hours, simply himself, simply a person, simply, beautifully asleep, as you are now, or very nearly so, as you should be, as you deserve to be. Sleep well.